Hello, I'm Sam Gruber. Welcome to another episode of an investigation of a historic Jewish monument. This is a series we've put together for CSP, and I'm happy to welcome you. I'm an art and architectural historian, and I spend a lot of my time looking at Jewish monuments of all sorts. And today we're going to look at one of my favorites, the Synagogue in Siena, Italy. I'm recording this in Italy now, and though I haven't visited the synagogue this year, I have been in the past, and I'm going to take you along for a visit through pictures with me. Many of you know the beautiful Tuscan town of Siena, one of the great centers of art and architecture in the High Middle Ages. It, of course, was a rival with Florence, and Americans and Israelis and other tourists who come to Italy frequently spend time on the spacious Campo that you see here in this image. It's one of the most popular spaces in Italy, and it's one of the most perfect urban spaces, I think, ever designed. What few people realize, including most Jewish visitors who go to Siena, is that just beyond that tower, just beyond the campanile of the big communal palace, down a little side street is a synagogue. It's not a big synagogue like the type that many of you are aware of from Florence or Rome that were built in the late 19th and early 20th century in the era of emancipation after Jews received freedom from the ghetto. But it's a little synagogue that's tucked away just at the very edge of this picture. You can see where I'm moving the cursor. A very modest building, unobtrusive, but just about 100 feet or 100 meters off of the Campo itself. That location and the modesty of the building, which you see here right in front of us, indicates the dichotomy, the tension that existed in Jewish life in Italy for many centuries, where Jews were very important to Italian cities and the urban life, but at the same time, they had to be circumspect in their presence. And in the case of this synagogue, they were actually in a ghetto, in an enclosed, enforced enclosed area at the time the present synagogue was built. Jews settled throughout Italy widely. They were there from antiquity, from Roman times, and particularly they spread in Central and Northern Europe to many different towns and cities after their expulsion from Southern Italy by the Spanish in the late 1400s and early 1500s. In Siena, they're actually recorded as early as the 13th century, and they were certainly present in the city during the period of great artistic and architectural expression. The Lorenzetti and Simone Martini, all these famous artists, they probably encountered Jews in their lives. But it's really only in the ghetto period that they come into focus, where we have a lot of documentation. And the synagogue that we see here was built in the late 18th century in 1786, but it probably stands on the site of a synagogue that dates to the period of the ghetto, which was instituted in 1571. And there may even have been an earlier synagogue on this place. So Jews were very central. They were close to the location of power and markets and pageants, but they also were sort of back there on the side streets facing away in a more modest circumstance. But here's the synagogue as you see it today. To get there from the Campo, you see you have to come down this little side street just past the big municipal palace, and then you have to do a sharp U-turn up this little street. And this street was once part of a tangle of other streets, most of which have been demolished or altered. But this is the one of the streets that constituted the old ghetto of the 16th century. The synagogue has survived intact, in part because it is so modest, perhaps, and walking by, you wouldn't know it has a glorious interior. I went to Siena many, many times in the 1970s and 80s. I didn't even know this synagogue was there. I confess I was interested more in medieval and Renaissance architecture at the time rather than Jewish history and cultural heritage sites. But in 1990, I did visit the synagogue for the first time. I was then a newly appointed director of a program for the World Monuments Fund called the Jewish Heritage Program. And we were looking for projects that we could help where Jewish sites needed international support for renovation, restoration, preservation, and the like. I went to Siena, and Mr. Lattes, Giuseppe Lattes, who was then the president of the Jewish community, showed me this building, absolutely stunning building, but hard to find and in a sad shape of a repair. There was water penetrating the roof, which was staining and destabilizing the great barrel vaults. The plaster was shabby. There was a sense of nobility, but great neglect. And I was struck by it. And unfortunately, we were a small program when we were already committed. Eastern Europe was opening up at the time, and we didn't have the funds to help with this project, although we did feature it in an exhibition and a conference. But fortunately, it took a long time, but in 2010, 2011, the building was fully restored, and today it's actually absolutely stunning. I can remember what it looked like before. A visitor today won't have that memory. They'll just see this beautiful interior, which we'll visit in just a second. We go in through this beautiful kind of neoclassical, neo-Renaissance portal, and you see that it's a tall building, a very box-like building. The facade is not distinctive, except we see lots of windows, which suggests there's going to be a big room with lots of light on the inside. We see there are 4 levels, possibly even 5 levels. The entrance, and then a main story, which we would call a piano nobile in Italian, and then there are upper stories above where there are also windows. And we'll experience that because we're going to climb a lot of stairs to get to these spaces and understand the interior within. As we go in on the left, you'll see there are plaques, commemorative plaques on the walls of the exterior. These were added later. The one on the top is very poetic. It commemorates Jews from Siena who were killed in the Holocaust. And it also is a broader general commemoration for all the Jewish victims of the Holocaust. And below, there's a plaque that was only put there in 1999. It's actually, it should be 1799 is the date. There was a riot, a sort of an anti-Jewish riot, just in the period after the ghetto was open, and this group called the Viva Maria devastated the ghetto, but they also pulled 13 Jewish citizens from the ghetto and they burned them in the Campo. And it was a horrific event, and it's commemorated here by this plaque as well, which was put up on the 200th anniversary. These really show the vicissitudes of life, and a kind of counter monument on the inside when we go in the hallway is this very ornate plaque, which commemorates 2 local Sienese Jews, Renato Cabibe and Raffaello Ponte Corboli, who were officers, tenente, they were lieutenants in the Italian army and killed in World War I. So we have monuments commemorating Jews who were killed, monuments which commemorate Jews who served Italy. And this really is the up and down of Jewish history in the Italian peninsula, either in the independent states early on or in unified Italy after 1870, and then through the period of fascism, and then even today. It's curious, this is one of a few, but of a substantial number of memorial plaques in Italy that one finds soldiers from World War I commemorated. There's a beautiful sort of Art Nouveau monument in the Venice Cemetery. There's a monument in the Ferrara Cemetery. Most of these monuments are in cemeteries and synagogues. So the audience is a Jewish audience, and it's intended to remind the Jewish audience essentially of the service and sacrifice of Jews to the patria, to the country. But also they were often visitors who were brought to the synagogue or visited on their own initiative. And sometimes these were government officials, sometimes they were nobles. We know of several, there are plaques commemorating such visits in the Siena synagogue itself. And these plaques were there to remind these people too that Jews were part of the broader culture, broader civilization and society. So immediately we come through this vaulted passage and then we go upstairs because that's where all the action is. And we pass a water basin for ritual purification, which may come from one of the earlier synagogues. And we come up to the second level. And these are drawings that were prepared for the restoration in 2011. And you see that coming through this narrow passage underneath, that's where the plaques are. We come up this stair and then we do a 180-degree turn and we're going to face the sanctuary and enter the doors of the sanctuary. There's some tzedakah boxes which were uncovered during the restoration for different charities. We see in this sort of vestibule area a beautiful mid-19th century Elijah chair, a chair where to sit and hold the baby at the time of circumcision. And this has a long history and it came from another site but was brought here. And it was donated by Rabbi Nissim, who was a famous leader of the community in the mid-19th century. But the main event is here. We walk through these doors and this wonderful vista of a very high and very elaborate space opens up before us. So coming through the door, we see the ark. We see a central bima here on floor level. It's not a big raised bima like in the Polish tradition, but it's right here accessible to the people. And beyond that is a very classically designed ark with fancy marbles and gilding and all sorts of inscriptions, which we'll look at. If we turn around, we see the door behind us, and you'll see on the second level big windows with alternating segmental and triangular pediments. But most notable are these ornate wooden grills which close the windows. These are not windows looking out into the light of the outside. These are actually windows that hide women who are in the women's section behind and allow them some tiny bit of sound and sight and air from the main event. Where were the women? The women were out of sight. This is a traditional Orthodox synagogue, and in the Italian tradition, as in the Sephardic tradition generally, we find the women are hidden away behind often elaborate grills. But we have space for them, so they're included in the religious experience, but they are separate and they are secondary. And that's the norms. I will say that today, when there are services in many of these older synagogues, women are down in the main space, even though they are, even when the service is an Orthodox one, some kind of divider will be set up, as we saw if you heard the talk on the Walnut Street Shul in Chelsea, Massachusetts. A temporary divider, mechitza, can be installed. The fact of the matter is the Siena congregation has become so small that there are rarely services here. There are other types of events, cultural events, so that's usually not an issue today. So let's take a closer look. We see a beautiful floor, kind of a terrazzo floor with patterned tiles. Most of this is probably from 1786, but we know the synagogue also was thoroughly refurbished in 1902 because there's a plaque that tells us this. So there could have been some changes then. The benches, these beautiful wooden benches and the wood that surrounds the lower level. And then above it, we see classical detail on the walls and a series of 14 inscriptions. We'll consider these in just a minute. These are all passages from Proverbs, from Psalms, from some other biblical books, and then we see the grills up above. The bima or the teva is possibly from the earlier synagogue. It's been dated to the 1750s. I really don't know if that's true or not, but it fits, and the whole composition is unified. It's not an interior where a little bit was done here, a little bit was done there. We really have a complete work of art when we enter this space. Here are the benches, beautiful wood benches. And if you look at the details, you'll see claws on the feet of the benches, and there's some other beautiful carved elements. We do know the names of the woodworkers and the decorators here. And they got credit very early on in the documents for their work. So the synagogue is set up for visitation, and you can go there. Now it's open to the public, but it's also, in a sense, ready for prayer should the opportunity arise. This is looking across the readers table to the ark behind. Just to give you some other views here. If we look up, we see these vaults. As I said, it's a very tall space, a boxy space, but it's not boxy the way it looks on the outside. It looks very open and airy once you're inside. And that's partly because of all the light coming in the windows, many different levels of windows, partly because of the walls themselves are porous because we have these grills that we can't see behind where the women are, but it gives us this sense of expanding space. The vertical elements carry us up, so our eye is carried to these vaults. Essentially, the whole space is a big barrel vaulted box. A barrel vault is just essentially an arch that is continued through space. But here, the barrel vault is broken up with larger arches and then smaller segments, what we call bays, and that gives a more visually varied experience. And it also allows for more decoration in the upper level, which you see here. And this is the same view that essentially that I showed you in that earlier slide. When I saw this in 1990, the plaster was falling, there were water stains, it was in bad condition, and now this has all been fixed. Here we see in the vault, we have cut some smaller vaults here, some smaller arches, and that allows the insertion of windows at this higher level, which allows even greater light. And then in the center, we have in stucco this multicolor representation of the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, the tablets, and we have the Hebrew, the first words of each of the commandments written out. The crown, which is Keter Torah, probably the crown of the Torah, but it's also just giving the commandments a kind of royal prestige. And then around it, clouds and the sunbursts coming out, the rays of light coming out. This is a very Baroque motif. If you go to St. Peter's in Rome, you'll see Bernini uses it, and many other artists do throughout the 1600s and the 1700s. But we also see it picked up in Jewish art a lot, maybe a little later, but we'll see these sunbursts coming on arcs or behind arcs in many decorative schemes in synagogues as we go forward. Even in the Chelsea synagogue that I mentioned before, the ceiling has a kind of sunrise sunburst coming right over the edge. But in other places, it's even more pronounced. And of course, the 10 Commandments are long before the Jewish star, the Magen David, became the norm as a symbol for Judaism. The menorah and the tablets of the law were the prime symbolic representations for giving Jewish identity to a place. The metalwork here is quite beautiful. It's all been restored. Here you can see, obviously, the lamps have been electrified. In the 18th century, there would have been no gas or electric. I don't know whether gas was ever used here. I think not. I think they probably went directly to electric in the early 20th century. And here you see the beautiful Aron HaKodesh, the Ark. It is, says Women's Gallery, that is obviously not correct. We have real marble here, but often in synagogues, and I believe in a few places here in Siena, we have faux marble. So it'll just be plaster, which is painted to look like marble. That's certainly the case in Venice. Today, that kind of fictive marble is very expensive, and it's very desirable for interior decorators. Then it was a cheap alternative because materials were expensive, real marble was expensive, labor was cheap. Today, materials are much cheaper because of ease of transport and quarrying and things like that, but labor is expensive. So craft labor to paint something to look like marble, that's very, very expensive. So that's kind of a flip that we've seen over the years. So here we go, looking at the beautiful ark designed by Giuseppe Del Rosso, who was a Florentine architect who designed the interior. And we have a series of inscriptions, one over the door and one up above here in the pediment, and then a crown here. So the first inscription, which is in this roundel in the pediment, is a very common one that you probably, many of you will know from synagogues, from modern synagogues today, know before whom you stand, Dalifne Miata Omed. And this is not actually a biblical quote, but it's a paraphrase, but it summarizes the experience one is supposed to have when worshiping in this synagogue and when one faces the ark. And then over the doors, we have this larger gilt inscription, and in his palace, everything says glory, coming from Psalms. And that's not as common an inscription, but it is one found in other synagogues too. In fact, we have here in the synagogue a great number of these little mottos or inscriptions. It's almost a primer. It's a great catalog of all-time hits for passages in synagogues. It's like one of those music compilations for a favorite singer. And what we have are 14 inscriptions in these little signs, gilt letters painted and framed with sort of a Baroque frame around with in between these volutes and set there. And each one is a very telling passage and appropriate for the synagogue. I'm not going to show pictures of every one, but I did pull a list, which should be coming up soon, of You Will Rise Up and Have Compassion on Zion, and so on. But here's the list of all of them. I won't read through them, but they're from Isaiah, they're from Proverbs, from Psalms, and the like. May my prayer come before you. Blessed is the man who listens to me, watching over my doors, and so on. And these are all appropriate to put one in the frame of mind for prayer. And of course, when you had a Hebrew literate congregation, these passages would be familiar. Many of them are actually drawn from the liturgy. For instance, Matovu, how beautiful are your tents, O Jacob. That's the first prayer one says coming into the synagogue in the morning. And it's also appropriate, how beautiful are your tents, your tabernacles, and the synagogue essentially is the successor, the continuation of the tents and the tabernacles described in antiquity. Okay, so that's the main experience, the main space. And you can see also the layout, that kind of square plan with the seats along the side, the beam in the center, is also great for processing, bringing the Torah out of the ark and carrying it around to the congregation. It's very immediate, sensual, and essentially community building, unless you're a woman. And then if you're a woman, you're behind those grills. You have to go up all of these stairs up to another level, and then you get into these spaces, which today are not used as women's spaces, but are being set up as meetings, meeting halls. And when I was there a few years ago, they were being created as exhibition spaces, which I think they now are today. But you can see they're not restricted spaces, they're not tight, but they are separate spaces. It's really a room apart from the main sanctuary space. And looking through, this is what you see. You really can't see all of the action that's taking place down below. If you position yourself strategically, you might see the ark, you might see some of the men seated below, you might see the procession, you might see the Torah, but there's no guarantee of that. So here's some more views. And then if you go up one level more, there's actually a fourth floor, kind of an attic level, where the rooms are a little smaller, and you can see the windows are smaller. These probably were not for women, but I think probably for classrooms, for children, or for other community administrative purposes. I'm upstairs in a house in Italy right now, and it's been a very hot summer. Upstairs get very hot because there's no air conditioning, there are no ceiling fans, and the sun just beats down on the roof. And the higher you go, the hotter it is, and the less air there is that circulates. So women in this case were not at the very top; they weren't getting the worst of it, but they were sandwiched in the middle. But in this top level, in the summer, it would probably be unbearable. In the winter, it might be chilly. This is true not just for synagogues and Jewish buildings, but for every type of building, pre-modern building. People had to experience that. Generally, the building itself, the big building, isolated building, it would be more prone to, we'll say, temperature, weather, dampness, fluctuations. One of the virtues, I don't want to extol virtues of the ghetto, but one virtue of older medieval quarters, old towns, and the ghettos, which were part of this same type of building and habitation, is that when you have a lot of buildings that are built close up together, packing in a lot of people, they're insulated. I mean, so there was actually a practical purpose for building in clusters. And so even if you go into a medieval town like Siena or where I am now in Todi, the neighborhoods are very tightly packed. That's for lots of reasons. You can reduce building materials by sharing walls, but also you increase insulation and shared heat and things like that. So it's not just about aesthetics, about something being quaint and beautiful the way we look at these towns today. There's actually real practical and purpose in the designs of what we see. And this was true in the ghettos as well, because the ghettos were just mini cities within the cities. And they followed pretty much all of the same types of building practices that we see elsewhere. In Siena, we saw that the synagogue was in brick, and Siena is a city of brick. But in other Italian cities, the synagogues might be built of stone. And then much later in the 19th and early 20th century, they become very big and they're outside of the ghetto, they're freestanding, and they're using new materials, concrete and iron and steel. And we may look at some of those synagogues later on in the series. I love the way the Siena sanctuary is revealed. It's really, this is a very Baroque concept where you have to go through many spaces, and each space becomes more significant and more opulent until the final reveal. And this was true in palaces, and if you've been to Versailles, it's that way too. It's what we call an enfilade. You go through a lot of spaces, and depending on how important you were, you could only go so far. But in a synagogue, we all know where we're going. We're getting, unless you're a woman actually, but if you're a man, you know where you're getting to that sanctuary. But you have this experience of compression and expansion and a kind of revelation. And as you go, you're supposed to be shedding the cares of the everyday, the experience of the everyday. And just as you wash yourself ritually for purification, you're not actually getting clean. It's just a symbolic act, but you become more, if not pure, you become more free as you approach that great space. And now that the sanctuary is restored, you enter that door and you have this lofty experience with light and not a lot of color, but some color, very subtle but delicate, contrasts. And it's really quite an uplifting experience. I confess, I have never been for a service in the Siena Synagogue. I have been in Rome and in Florence and Venice and other places. And when you're in these spaces for a religious service with the music and the just the warmth or the heat of the people and the murmur and the chanting, that also adds elements too, and that can transform a space. That can transform even the simplest space into a sacred space, into a very special place. So I hope you enjoyed this visit to Siena. It's a favorite synagogue of mine, quite beautiful. I was blessed by having a tour guide when I was there last, who knows the building really from top to bottom, from bottom to top. And that's Ana Di Castro, who is a community member, an organizer, an activist, and has been very, very involved in promoting the Jewish history and culture of Siena. She is from an old Italian family. Unfortunately, there are very few Jews left in Siena today, so the community is now linked to that of Florence. However, on the bright side, the synagogue is open most of the year to the public. It has regular hours for visitation. I believe Anna is sometimes there to take people through, and there are other qualified guides. So when you're in Siena next time, don't just go to the Campo, don't just go to the Duomo, don't just go to the art museum, stop and see the synagogue too, and I guarantee you'll be glad that you did. Until next time, this is Sam Gruber for the Community Speakers Program, the CSP, and have a good day and a good week.